The silence before the storm is always the most dangerous. And on the night of June 5th, 1944, that silence hung over the beaches of Normandy like a shroud. Somewhere in the German defensive network stretching across the French coastline, a single Wehrmacht major stood at the intersection of duty and doom. His name has been largely forgotten by history, buried beneath the tidal wave of narratives about Eisenhower's grand strategy, Rommel's desperate warnings, and Hitler's narcotic-induced sleep that kept him from responding to the invasion for crucial hours. But this officer, this one man positioned in exactly the right place at exactly the wrong time, saw what was coming before anyone else in the German command structure could comprehend it. He saw the future, and he knew Germany had already lost. To understand the psychological weight of that moment, we must first understand what the German military apparatus had become by mid-1944. The Wehrmacht was no longer the unstoppable blitzkrieg machine that had torn through Poland, France, and deep into the Soviet Union. It was a fractured organism, hollowed out by years of attrition on the Eastern Front, strangled by Allied air superiority, and rotting from within due to a command structure poisoned by ideology, paranoia, and Hitler's increasingly erratic interference. The German officer corps, once a bastion of Prussian professionalism, had been systematically corrupted, filled with yes-men and Nazi loyalists who replaced competence with fanaticism. But some officers still remembered what real war looked like. Some still possessed the cold, analytical clarity that had made the German general staff legendary. This major was one of them. Stationed in a critical observation post along the Norman coast, his job was monotonous: watch the sea, report anomalies, maintain defensive readiness. For months he had stared at those gray waters, watching the tides roll in and out, scanning for the invasion everyone knew was coming, but no one could predict. The German High Command was paralyzed by uncertainty. Would the Allies strike at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing from England? Would they hit Norway, Brittany? The entire defensive strategy, Hitler's vaunted Atlantic Wall, was spread dangerously thin, a facade of concrete bunkers and beach obstacles stretched across thousands of miles. Behind this wall stood divisions of varying quality, some elite, many composed of conscripts, overage soldiers, or pressed foreign troops with no loyalty to the Reich. The Germans were playing a deadly guessing game, and they were losing even before the first Allied soldier set foot on French soil. Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, had been appointed to strengthen coastal defenses. He understood the reality. If the Allies established a beachhead, if they broke through in the first 24 hours, Germany would lack the resources to push them back into the sea. The war would be over, not immediately, but inevitably. He'd said it plainly: the war will be won or lost on the beaches. But Rommel's authority was limited. He clashed constantly with his superior, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who believed the proper strategy was to hold panzer reserves inland and counterattack once the invasion site was confirmed. This strategic paralysis, reserve divisions held back, unable to move without Hitler's personal authorization, would prove catastrophic. And there, in this web of dysfunction and denial, sat our major, a professional soldier trained in reconnaissance and intelligence assessment, a man who understood logistics, naval operations, and the mathematics of amphibious assault. Unlike the fantasists in Berlin, who still believed in wonder weapons and divine providence, he dealt in facts. And the facts, as they accumulated through that tense spring of 1944, told an unmistakable story. He had watched Allied air raids systematically destroy transportation networks across France. He had seen the Luftwaffe disappear from the skies, outmatched and outgunned. He had read intelligence reports about massive troop concentrations in southern England. He understood that Germany's industrial capacity was being obliterated by round-the-clock bombing, while Allied production reached levels that defy comprehension. He knew that the Eastern Front was devouring German divisions faster than they could be replaced, that the army was cannibalizing itself just to maintain the line. But knowledge and acceptance are different things. The human mind resists conclusions that threaten its entire worldview. For years, German propaganda had insisted that the Reich was invincible, that setbacks were temporary, that final victory was certain. Even rational officers, even those who could see the numbers clearly, often couldn't make the final leap to acknowledging total defeat. Cognitive dissonance is a powerful force. It allows people to hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously, to know something intellectually while rejecting it emotionally. Our major, however, had moved beyond denial.
Perhaps he'd lost too many comrades. Perhaps he'd simply done the math too many times. Whatever the reason, when the reports started coming in during those dark hours of June 6th, reports of massive naval activity, of thousands of ships, of paratroopers dropping inland, he didn't waste time on hope or delusion. He knew exactly what he was seeing, and he knew exactly what it meant.
The first reports were fragmentary, almost dreamlike in their impossibility. Paratroopers falling from the sky inland, gliders crash landing in fields, naval gunfire erupting from the darkness. And then, as dawn broke over the channel, the truth materialized out of the morning mist like a vision from hell. Over 5,000 ships. The major stood at his observation post, binoculars pressed to his face, and witnessed what no German officer had ever seen: the entire industrial might of the Anglo-American alliance arrayed in a single devastating blow. The horizon wasn't just dotted with vessels, it was carpeted with them. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport ships, landing craft by the thousands. The sea itself seemed to have transformed into a mechanical organism, pulsing with lethal intent. Above, the sky belonged entirely to the Allies. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, they owned the air so completely that the Luftwaffe might as well have ceased to exist. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't a feint. This was the reckoning. In that moment, the major experienced what few humans ever confront: the precise instant when the future becomes clear, when uncertainty collapses into terrible certainty. Every assumption that had structured his professional life, every doctrine he'd been taught, every strategic calculation, all of it became obsolete in the span of a few hours. Germany couldn't repel this. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The Allies could afford to lose 10,000 men and replace them within weeks. They could lose 100 ships and build more within months. They had resources on a scale that made German capacity look medieval by comparison. But recognizing defeat and reporting it were entirely different propositions. The Wehrmacht in 1944 operated within a culture of enforced optimism that bordered on psychosis. Officers who delivered bad news were often accused of defeatism, removed from command, or worse. The Nazi Party had introduced political officers and ideological commissars into military units, creating an atmosphere of suspicion where honest assessment could be interpreted as treason. Speaking the truth could get you arrested by the Gestapo, tried before the People's Court, and executed. Moreover, the German command structure had become so dysfunctional that accurate information often couldn't travel upward even when officers tried to report it. Hitler had surrounded himself with sycophants who filtered intelligence to match his preconceptions. He had forbidden retreat, forbidden defensive preparations that acknowledged the possibility of loss, forbidden even the vocabulary of setback. When his generals tried to explain military realities, he dismissed them as weak, cowardly, or treasonous. He believed, genuinely believed, that willpower could overcome material disadvantage, that fanaticism was a substitute for tanks and aircraft. This was the environment in which our major had to make his decision. He could see the invasion fleet. He understood its implications. But who could he tell? His immediate superior? The regimental commander? Would they forward his assessment up the chain, or would they suppress it to protect their own positions? And even if the information reached higher command, what difference would it make? The German response to D-Day is a case study in organizational paralysis. Rommel wasn't even in Normandy. He'd traveled to Germany for his wife's birthday, convinced that weather conditions made invasion unlikely. Von Rundstedt received reports of the landings but couldn't order the Panzer reserves to move without authorization from Berlin. And in Berlin, Hitler slept. His staff, terrified of waking him and facing his wrath, let crucial hours slip away. When he finally woke and reviewed the situation, he initially dismissed Normandy as a diversion, convinced the real invasion would come at Calais. This wasn't merely incompetence. It was the inevitable result of a totalitarian system where truth becomes subordinate to ideology, where leaders surround themselves with loyalists rather than experts, where dissent is purged and replaced with fanaticism. The Nazis had spent years destroying the traditional military hierarchy, replacing career officers with party members, inserting political considerations into tactical decisions. They had created a military apparatus that was structurally incapable of responding to reality. Our major understood all of this. He'd watched it happen over the course of the war. He'd seen competent commanders replaced with Nazi zealots. He'd witnessed strategic decisions made for political rather than military reasons. He'd learned to navigate a system where speaking truth was dangerous and remaining silent was complicit.
And now, watching the greatest amphibious assault in human history unfold before his eyes, he faced the ultimate test of that impossible position. Some officers in similar situations chose denial. They convinced themselves that German reserves would counterattack successfully, that the Atlantic Wall would hold, that the invasion would be thrown back into the sea just as Hitler promised. Cognitive dissonance allowed them to witness overwhelming Allied superiority while still believing in German victory. The human brain is remarkably skilled at filtering out information that threatens core beliefs. Others chose submission. They filed their reports, followed their orders, and let the system process information, or fail to process it, according to its own broken logic. They absolved themselves of responsibility by becoming mere cogs in the machine, doing their jobs without considering the larger implications. But a very few, chose clarity. They looked at the evidence, accepted its meaning, and lived with the psychological burden of knowing the war was lost while still being trapped within it. These were the ones who experienced a unique form of torment, fighting for a cause they knew was doomed, following orders they understood were futile, watching men die for a Reich that had already ceased to exist except as a vengeful ghost consuming its own people. Our major belonged to this third category, and as he lowered his binoculars and turned to make his report, he carried with him a burden that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life, the knowledge that he had seen the future, understood it completely, and was powerless to change it. The invasion was succeeding, Germany was finished, and the dying had only just begun.
The machinery of war grinds forward with its own momentum, indifferent to the awareness of those trapped within it. Understanding that you are defeated does not grant you the luxury of surrender, not when you serve a regime that has criminalized reality itself. The Major's report traveled through the German command structure like a stone dropped into tar, slow, heavy, absorbed by layers of bureaucracy, ideology, and willful blindness. His assessment was clear, professional, devastating. The Allied invasion force was of such magnitude that local reserves were insufficient to contain it. Air superiority made German reinforcement nearly impossible, and the window for effective counterattack was measured in hours, not days. He knew as he wrote it that the words would likely be diluted, reinterpreted, or simply ignored by the time they reached anyone with authority to act. And he was right. At 7th Army headquarters, Field Marshal Rommel's absence created a vacuum of decision-making. The staff officers on duty that night found themselves paralyzed, unwilling to take responsibility for mobilizing armor without explicit authorization. They could see the reports accumulating, paratrooper drops, naval bombardment, beach landings, but the system had conditioned them to wait for orders from above rather than seize initiative. This was another cancer the Nazi system had introduced into German military culture, the destruction of the traditional Prussian concept of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics that empowered junior officers to make independent decisions. Hitler demanded obedience, not initiative. The result was an army that could execute brilliantly when following a plan, but crumbled when forced to improvise. Von Rundstedt, commander of all German forces in the West, requested permission to commit the Panzer Reserves at 4 a.m. The request went to OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command, where it sat, unanswered. Hitler was asleep. No one dared wake him. Chief of Staff Jodl reviewed the situation and made a catastrophic decision. He ordered 2 panzer divisions to move toward Normandy, but not to engage. They were to wait for Hitler's personal authorization before attacking. This half-measure satisfied no one and accomplished nothing, except to put German armor on roads where Allied aircraft could find and destroy them. When Hitler finally woke around 10 a.m., he had already been robbed of the only advantage Germany still possessed: time. The hours between 6 a.m. and noon on June 6th were decisive. During that window, Allied forces were most vulnerable, still consolidating their beachheads, still struggling to move armor and heavy weapons ashore. A coordinated panzer counterattack launched at dawn might not have driven them into the sea, but it could have disrupted the landing schedule, inflicted severe casualties, and bought time for further reinforcements. Instead, Hitler dithered, convinced this was a diversion, certain the main assault would come elsewhere. His paranoia had metastasized into a complete inability to process information that contradicted his preconceptions. Our major, meanwhile, remained at his post, watching the invasion strengthen by the hour. More ships arrived. More men poured ashore. The naval bombardment intensified, systematically destroying German strongpoints. Allied fighter bombers ranged inland, attacking anything that moved. The Atlantic Wall, that propaganda masterpiece of impregnable fortifications, revealed itself as a hollow fiction. Concrete bunkers were impressive until you realized there weren't nearly enough of them, that they lacked adequate supplies and reinforcement, that they were manned by under-strength units with no air cover and no hope of relief.
The psychological experience of witnessing inevitable defeat unfold in real time is difficult to articulate. There's a dissociative quality to it, a sense of watching yourself participate in events you know are futile. The Major continued performing his duties, coordinating what little defensive action was possible, relaying information, maintaining discipline among his men, but every action was shadowed by the knowledge of its ultimate meaninglessness. This is what soldiers in hopeless situations face, the obligation to continue fighting not because victory is possible, but because the alternative is unthinkable within the culture that has shaped them. By midday, the beaches had names that would echo through history: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Each represented a foothold that was expanding despite fierce German resistance in some sectors. At Omaha, American forces had faced a slaughter that nearly succeeded in stopping them, but only nearly. They paid in blood, but they held. They pushed forward. The German defenders, many of them impressed Eastern Europeans or overage conscripts, fought with varying degrees of commitment. Some resisted fanatically, others surrendered at the first opportunity. The Wehrmacht was no longer the unified force it had been in 1940. Years of losses had created a patchwork military where elite SS divisions fought alongside hollow shells of units that existed more on paper than in reality. The Major observed another crucial truth. German intelligence had failed catastrophically. The Allies had successfully deceived German command about the invasion location through Operation Fortitude, an elaborate deception plan that convinced Hitler a massive army group under Patton was preparing to invade at Pas-de-Calais. Even as the Normandy landings proceeded, significant German forces remained hundreds of miles away guarding against a threat that didn't exist. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, had been so thoroughly penetrated by Allied double agents that it was essentially feeding the German high command fiction disguised as fact. This was the result of another totalitarian pathology. Security services more focused on internal loyalty enforcement than external intelligence gathering. The SD and Gestapo had spent the war hunting domestic enemies, purging suspected dissidents, enforcing ideological conformity. Real intelligence work, the patient, unglamorous business of gathering and analyzing foreign information, had been subordinated to paranoid internal surveillance. The result was a regime that knew everything about its own citizens and almost nothing about its actual enemies. As the sun began its descent on June 6th, the Major compiled his end-of-day assessment. Over 150,000 Allied troops had landed. The beachheads were secure and expanding. German counterattacks had been piecemeal and ineffective. Luftwaffe response was negligible. The panzer divisions that finally received authorization to attack were being decimated by airstrikes before they could even reach the front. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and clear. Germany was losing this battle at a rate that could not be sustained. He included one final observation in his report, knowing it would likely be redacted or ignored. The enemy has achieved strategic surprise through operational deception and tactical superiority in all domains: air, sea, and combined arms coordination. Our defensive posture is reactive and fragmented. Without immediate, massive reinforcement and unified command authority, the containment of this invasion exceeds our current capability. In the careful, professional language of military assessment, he was saying, "We have already lost." The report was filed. The Major returned to his duties, and the war ground forward, indifferent to individual comprehension of its outcome.
There is a particular species of tragedy reserved for those who see the future clearly, but remain bound to a past that refuses to die. The Major became a ghost haunting his own life, alive, functional, performing his duties, yet fundamentally already mourned. The days following D-Day unfolded with the grim predictability of a mathematical proof. Every variable the Major had identified played out exactly as the logic demanded. Allied forces continued pouring into Normandy. The Bocage, the dense Norman hedgerow country, slowed their advance but couldn't stop it. German counterattacks were launched with desperation and courage, but without the coordination, air support, or numerical superiority necessary to succeed. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed largely of fanatical teenage volunteers indoctrinated since childhood, fought with suicidal intensity and achieved nothing except their own destruction. Bravery without strategic viability is just organized dying. Rommel returned to Normandy on June 7th and immediately grasped what the Major had understood 2 days earlier: the invasion could not be stopped. He said as much to his staff, to his superiors, to anyone who would listen. The Desert Fox, Hitler's favorite general, the man who had embarrassed the British in North Africa, now advocated for the one thing the Führer would never permit: a negotiated peace, an acknowledgement of reality, a strategic withdrawal to defensible positions. For this heresy, Rommel would eventually be implicated in the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler and forced to commit suicide. The Nazi regime had reached the stage where competent generals were more dangerous than enemy armies. The Major watched this unfold with the detached clarity of someone who had already accepted the inevitable. He saw the pattern repeating itself across every level of command. Officers who understood the military situation ran headlong into a political system that had criminalized understanding itself. Hitler's response to setbacks was always the same: blame subordinates, demand more fanaticism, issue orders that contradicted physical reality, stand fast orders that turned mobile warfare into static slaughter, prohibitions on retreat that transformed tactical withdrawals into encirclements and annihilation. A strategic doctrine based not on preserving force and trading space for time, but on holding every meter of ground regardless of cost. This was the natural endpoint of totalitarian military thinking. When ideology becomes more important than reality, when the leader's will supersedes logistical possibility, when admitting problems is treated as treason, the entire system becomes trapped in a doom loop. Bad news can't travel upward, so leaders make decisions based on fantasy. Those decisions fail, creating worse situations, which generate more bad news that can't be reported. The cycle accelerates until catastrophic collapse. By late June, the Allies had landed over 850,000 men, 148,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supplies. Cherbourg fell on the 26th, giving the Allies a deep-water port. German casualties were mounting at unsustainable rates, and replacements were either unavailable or of such poor quality, elderly conscripts, impressed foreigners, teenage boys, that they barely qualified as combat effective. The Major watched units arrive at the front that were divisions in name only, understrength, poorly equipped, commanded by officers promoted beyond their competence due to the attrition of experienced leaders. What haunted him most wasn't the dying. Soldiers understand that death is the occupation's hazard, but the purposelessness of it. Men were being fed into a battle that was already decided, sacrificed not to achieve victory, but to delay the inevitable, to satisfy Hitler's megalomaniacal refusal to acknowledge defeat. Every German soldier killed after D-Day died not defending Germany, but defending Hitler's delusional self-image. This is the final obscenity of authoritarian collapse. The regime consumes its own people to prolong its death throes. The Major began to recognize the same awareness in others. In quiet conversations with fellow officers, in the exhausted eyes of veterans, in the bitter cynicism of soldiers who had survived too much. A network of unspoken understanding developed among those who could see clearly. We are fighting for a corpse that doesn't know it's dead. But this knowledge existed in whispers, in implications, in carefully coded language. Speaking it plainly remained suicidal. The SS and Gestapo were everywhere, watching for defeatism, ready to make examples of anyone who questioned ultimate victory. In July, the assassination attempt against Hitler failed. The conspirators, many of them senior Wehrmacht officers, were tortured and executed, often hung with piano wire from meat hooks, their deaths filmed for Hitler's viewing pleasure. The purge that followed destroyed what remained of the traditional officer corps, replacing experience with fanaticism, professionalism with loyalty oaths. The Major watched this purge eliminate men he'd respected, officers who had tried to preserve some vestige of military honor within a dishonorable regime. Their deaths confirmed what he'd known since June 6th. There would be no rational conclusion to this war, no negotiated settlement, no strategic wisdom prevailing at the last moment. Germany would fight until it was physically destroyed. August brought Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy. German forces in France began to collapse, not in orderly retreat, but in disintegration. The Falaise Pocket became a killing ground where entire divisions were encircled and annihilated. Paris was liberated. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat toward the German border. And still, Hitler issued orders forbidding withdrawal, demanding counterattacks that units no longer existed to execute, threatening commanders who reported the truth with court-martial and execution. The Major survived, many didn't. He was eventually withdrawn as part of the general collapse, retreating eastward with the shattered remnants of Wehrmacht formations. He would fight through the winter, through the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final offensive gamble in the West, and into the spring of 1945. But he was never fighting to win. From June 6, 1944 forward, he was simply surviving the death of a regime that refused to die peacefully. When the war finally ended, when the Reich lay in ruins, Hitler dead by his own hand in his bunker, German cities reduced to rubble, millions dead for nothing, the Major was left with the burden of his clarity. He had known, he had seen it coming, and it had changed nothing. This is the curse of insight in totalitarian systems. Understanding doesn't grant power. Clarity doesn't enable action. You can see the future perfectly and remain helpless to alter it, trapped in a machine that operates according to its own terrible logic until it destroys itself completely. The Major saw D-Day first. He knew it was over. And then he had to live through all the dying that came after knowledge, after understanding, in the long, brutal aftermath of a truth that no one in power wanted to hear. Some tragedies are written in blood. Others are written in the silent awareness of those who see catastrophe approaching and can do nothing but watch it unfold, one inevitable death at a time.